They kicked the homeless man out of the alley, not knowing he was the Don who secretly ruled the city. The November rain hammered the cobblestones of Chicago's South Side like bullets from a Tommy gun, each drop exploding into 1,000 smaller fragments before disappearing into the grimy darkness between the buildings. Steam rose from the manholes, creating an otherworldly fog that seemed to swallow the yellow glow of the gas lamp's hole. In this maze of brick and mortar, where the smell of bootleg whiskey mixed with the acrid smoke from the steel mills, Vinny Torino pulled his threadbare coat tighter around his shoulders and settled deeper into the narrow alley behind Mallory's delicatessen. To anyone passing by, he was just another casualty of the Great War and the economic uncertainty that followed. His beard was unkempt, his clothes bore the stains of weeks on the street, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had lost everything. But beneath those rags lay the sharp mind that had built the most sophisticated criminal network Chicago had ever seen. For 3 months, Vinny had been living this charade, testing the loyalty of his organization, studying the movements of rival families, and most importantly, staying invisible while the heat from a federal investigation cooled down. The alley was perfect for his purposes, narrow enough that only one person could pass through at a time, with a clear view of both entrances, and close enough to his legitimate businesses that he could observe the daily operations without being detected. Mrs. Mallory, the elderly woman who owned the delicatessen, had been leaving him scraps of food, not out of kindness, but because Vinny had once saved her grandson from a beating by Irish dock workers. She didn't know who he really was, but she recognized the look of a man who had seen too much violence. The sound of expensive leather shoes echoed against the wet bricks, growing louder as they approached. Vinny didn't look up from the newspaper he was pretending to read, 3 days old and soggy from the rain, but it served its purpose. Through his peripheral vision, he watched as 2 men in tailored overcoats entered the alley. He recognized them immediately, Marcus Webb and James Fitzgerald, low-level enforcers who worked for the O'Malley crew, one of the Irish gangs trying to muscle in on his territory while he was supposedly missing. Webb was a tall, thin man with a perpetual sneer and hands that were always looking for a fight. Fitzgerald was shorter, but built like a prizefighter, with scarred knuckles and a reputation for enjoying his work too much. They had been making moves against Vinny's operations for weeks, thinking that with the Don gone, the Torino organization was vulnerable. "Look what we got here, Jimmy," Webb said, his voice carrying the harsh accent of the docks. "Another bum cluttering up our neighborhood." Vinny kept his eyes on the newspaper, though every muscle in his body was coiled like a spring. These men had no idea they were speaking to the man who controlled every speakeasy, gambling den, and protection racket from the Loop to the stockyards. In his heyday, a single word from Vincent Torino could end careers, start wars, or make men disappear forever. Now, he was just another homeless veteran that society had forgotten. "You hear that, old man?" Fitzgerald stepped closer, his boots splashing in a puddle just inches from where Vinny sat. "This here's a respectable business district. We can't have the likes of you scaring away customers." The irony wasn't lost on Vinny. These same streets where they were trying to run him off had once trembled at the mention of his name. The speakeasy 3 blocks north had been his idea. The gambling operation in the warehouse district had been his investment, and the protection money that kept the local businesses safe from exactly the kind of men standing before him had been his innovation. He had built an empire not through mindless violence, but through strategic thinking, careful alliances, and an understanding that real power came from being indispensable rather than just feared. "I ain't causing no trouble," Vinny mumbled, affecting the defeated tone of a broken man. "Just trying to stay dry is all." Webb laughed, a sound like broken glass. "Ain't causing trouble? You're existing, ain't you? That's trouble enough." He reached down and grabbed the newspaper from Vinny's hands, tearing it in half. "Time to move along, Grandpa. Find yourself another alley to die in." For a moment, Vinny's mask almost slipped. The casual disrespect, the assumption that he was powerless, the way they looked at him like he was already dead, it awakened something dangerous in his chest. But he forced himself to remain still, to play the part. This performance had a purpose beyond simple survival. Every day he spent on these streets was a lesson in how quickly respect could evaporate, how thin the line was between power and irrelevance. "Please," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I got nowhere else to go. The mission's full up, and..." Fitzgerald's boot connected with Vinny's ribs, not hard enough to do serious damage, but firm enough to send a message. Did we stutter? Move, along. Vinny slowly gathered his few possessions. A battered suitcase that contained nothing but old clothes and newspapers, a wool blanket that smelled like the streets, and a metal cup that had collected enough rainwater to last him through the morning. As he stood, he allowed himself to seem unsteady, older than his 45 years, broken by circumstances beyond his control, but his eyes, hidden beneath the brim of a stolen hat, were already calculating. Webb and Fitzgerald had just made the biggest mistake of their short, violent lives. They had humiliated Vincent Torino, even if they didn't know it yet. In his world, respect was currency, and they had just stolen from the bank. As he shuffled toward the mouth of the alley, Vinny caught sight of a familiar figure across the street. Tommy Marconi, his most trusted lieutenant, was watching from the shadows of a doorway. Their eyes met for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Tommy's slight nod confirmed what Vinny already knew. The pieces were in place, the network was intact, and it was almost time for Vincent Torino to rise from the dead. The abandoned warehouse on the edge of Little Italy looked like every other derelict building in Chicago's industrial district. Broken windows covered with newspaper, rust bleeding down the brick walls like old wounds, and weeds growing through cracks in the concrete. But beneath the decay lay the beating heart of the most sophisticated criminal organization in the Midwest. Tommy Marconi pushed open the heavy door and stepped into what appeared to be an empty space, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous darkness. "It's me," he called out, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a man who had spent too many years breathing cigarette smoke and speaking in whispers. The transformation was immediate. Lights flickered on, revealing a fully operational command center that would have impressed the Chicago Police Department. Maps of the city covered one wall, marked with colored pins indicating territory, operations, and rival gang activities. A row of telephone lines connected to a switchboard operated by a thin woman with sharp eyes and faster fingers. In the center of the room, a large table held stacks of ledgers, cash counts, and detailed reports on everything from speakeasy profits to police patrol schedules. This was Vincent Torino's true legacy, not the violence that made headlines, but the methodical organization that made violence unnecessary. While other gangs fought bloody wars over street corners, Vinny had built something more sustainable, a business empire that happened to operate outside the law. Maria Santos looked up from the switchboard as Tommy approached. She had been Vinny's eyes and ears for over a decade, coordinating communications between 23 different operations across the city. Every bookie, every speakeasy manager, every dock worker on Vinny's payroll reported through her network. If a rival gang was planning a move, if the feds were sniffing around, if a politician needed his palm greased, Maria knew about it within hours. "He's alive," she said without preamble, her slight Spanish accent adding gravity to the words. "I saw him 3 blocks from Mallory's and he looked—" She paused, searching for the right description. "He looked like exactly what he's pretending to be." Tommy removed his fedora and ran a hand through his graying hair. At 38, he had been with Vinny since the early days, when the organization was just a neighborhood protection racket run out of his uncle's barber shop. He understood better than anyone the calculated genius behind his boss's disappearance. While the O'Malleys, the Kowalskis, and even some of their own associates assumed Vinny was dead or had fled the city, the real power structure remained intact, operating through carefully maintained channels of communication. "The Irish boys are getting bolder," reported Frank Castellano from his position at the map table. Frank managed the South Side gambling operations and had the kind of mathematical mind that could calculate odds while bullets were flying around his head. "Webb and Fitzgerald hit 2 of our numbers runners yesterday. Took the day's collections and roughed up Mickey Torelli pretty good." "Mickey's okay?" Tommy asked, genuine concern in his voice. The organization's strength came from loyalty, and loyalty had to flow both ways. Every soldier, every associate, every person who risked their freedom or their life for the family knew that Vincent Torino would move heaven and earth to protect them. Broken nose, couple of cracked ribs, but he's talking about getting back to work tomorrow, Frank replied. "Kid's got heart." "But the message is clear. They think we're weak without the dawn visible." Sarah McKinney emerged from the back office carrying a stack of financial reports. She was an anomaly in this world, a college-educated woman from a respectable family who had discovered she had a talent for money laundering and legitimate business operations. Under her management, Vinny's criminal profits were flowing through a network of legitimate businesses, restaurants, construction companies, and even a small bank that catered to Italian immigrants who couldn't get loans elsewhere. "The numbers tell a different story," she said, spreading the reports across the table. "Our legitimate operations are up 18% since Vinny went underground. The restaurants are packed, the construction crews are getting city contracts, and the bank just approved its largest loan ever. People respect the Torino name even when they can't see the man behind it." This was the complexity that separated Vincent Torino from common thugs. While his rivals focused on territorial control through violence, he had built an organization that created value for the community it served. His speakeasies didn't just sell illegal alcohol. They provided jobs, entertainment, and a sense of community during the dark days of Prohibition. His protection services weren't just extortion. They genuinely kept neighborhoods safe from robbery, assault, and the kind of random violence that plagued other parts of the city. "There's something else," Maria said, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Yuri Federal Agent Harrison has been asking questions about Vinny's disappearance. He's been talking to Jimmy Torino." The room fell silent. Jimmy was Vinny's younger brother, a weak man with expensive tastes and a gambling problem that had made him vulnerable to pressure. He knew enough about the organization to cause serious damage, but lacked the intelligence and loyalty that made him trustworthy with sensitive information. Tommy's jaw tightened. "Yuri, what kind of questions?" "The kind that suggest they think Vinny might still be alive. Harrison's smart, smarter than the usual federal boys. He's been studying the organization's structure, and he's noticed that operations are continuing too smoothly for a decapitated organization." Frank looked up from his calculations. "Maybe it's time to bring Vinny back. We've got enough evidence that the feds can't touch him for the original charges, and with him visible again, the Irish problem disappears overnight." "It's not that simple," Sarah interjected. "Vinny's not just hiding from the feds or the Irish. He's testing something. Every day he stays on the streets. He's learning something about us, about the organization, about how the city really works when people think he's not watching." She was right, and Tommy knew it. Vincent Torino didn't do anything without multiple purposes. The man who had built Chicago's most successful criminal organization from nothing wasn't content to simply maintain power. He was always looking for ways to expand it, perfect it, make it more resilient against the forces that constantly threatened to tear it apart. The telephone rang, cutting through the discussion. Maria answered with her standard greeting. "Sunshine Laundry, how may I help you?" After a moment of listening, her expression changed. She covered the receiver and looked at Tommy. "It's Mickey Torelli. He says Webb and Fitzgerald just threw a homeless man out of the alley behind Mallory's. Kicked him around pretty good before they made him leave." The pieces clicked together in Tommy's mind, like the chambers of a well-oiled revolver. He looked at the others and saw the same realization dawning on their faces. After 3 months of careful planning, strategic patience, and methodical preparation, Vincent Torino had just been given the perfect excuse to remind Chicago exactly who was in charge. "Tell Mickey to keep watching," Tommy said quietly, "and get word to all our people. The Don is about to come home." The Chicago theater glowed like a golden palace against the gray November sky, its marquee announcing the latest vaudeville revue to crowds of well-dressed patrons who seemed oblivious to the economic struggles happening just blocks away. But Vincent Torino wasn't interested in the show. He stood across the street in the shadows of an ornate building, watching the theater's back entrance where he knew Marcus Webb spent his Thursday evenings collecting protection money from the manager. 3 hours had passed since Webb and Fitzgerald had kicked him out of the alley. 3 hours that had given Vinny time to shed his homeless disguise and transform back into the man who had built an empire in the shadows of the Windy City. Gone were the threadbare clothes and the defeated posture. In their place stood a figure that commanded attention without demanding it, a man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, with steel-gray eyes that had seen enough violence to appreciate the value of strategic patience. The transformation hadn't taken place in some dramatic reveal. Instead, Vinny had simply walked 3 blocks to a nondescript apartment building where Tommy Marconi had been maintaining a safe house for exactly this purpose. Clean clothes, hot water, a proper shave, and most importantly, the kind of confidence that came from knowing that every street corner in a 20-block radius was under his influence. Webb emerged from the theater's stage door at exactly 8:30, just as he had every Thursday for the past 6 weeks. He was counting a roll of bills, his attention focused on the money rather than his surroundings, a mistake that would have gotten him killed years ago when the territorial wars were still being fought with Thompson submachine guns instead of economic pressure. "Marcus Webb," Vinny said quietly, stepping out of the shadows. The Irish enforcer looked up, and for a moment, his face showed only mild curiosity. Then recognition dawned, and the color drained from his cheeks like water from a broken dam. The roll of bills fell from his nerveless fingers, scattering across the wet pavement like oversized confetti. Vincent Torino," Webb stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "But everyone said you were dead," Vinny smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Disappeared. Gone forever." He took a step closer, and Webb instinctively backed against the brick wall of the theater. "I've been right here the whole time, Marcus. Watching, learning, seeing exactly what happens when people think Vincent Torino is no longer paying attention." The mathematics of power shifted in real time. Webb had spent weeks building confidence, making moves against Torino operations, establishing himself as a player in the post-Vinny landscape. Now, faced with the reality that his assumptions had been catastrophically wrong, he was scrambling to recalculate his position. "Look, Mr. Torino, I don't know what you heard, but I heard everything, Marcus. I heard it firsthand when you kicked a homeless veteran out of an alley. I felt it firsthand when your boot connected with ribs that have been broken twice before, in service to this country." Vinny's voice remained conversational, but something in his tone made Webb's hands shake. "The question now is what we're going to do about it." From the shadows of nearby doorways, figures began to emerge. Tommy Marconi stepped into the circle of light cast by a street lamp, his hand resting casually on the bulge beneath his coat. Frank Castellano appeared from around the corner, flanked by 2 men Webb didn't recognize, but whose presence made his mouth go dry. Maria Santos materialized from what had seemed like an empty alley, her sharp eyes cataloging every detail of Webb's appearance and demeanor. This was how Vincent Torino operated, not through dramatic confrontations or public displays of violence, but through the careful orchestration of pressure that made resistance seem not just futile, but pointless. Webb found himself surrounded by the most efficient criminal organization in the Midwest, led by a man who had just demonstrated that death itself couldn't break his control over the city's underworld. "Here's what's going to happen, Marcus," Vinny continued, his voice still carrying that deceptively casual tone. "You're going to walk back to your boss, Patrick O'Malley, and you're going to tell him exactly what you saw tonight. You're going to explain that Vincent Torino is very much alive, very much in control, and very much interested in having a conversation about recent territorial misunderstandings." Webb nodded frantically, but Vinny held up a hand. "Tori, I'm not finished. You're also going to return every dollar you've taken from operations that belong to me. You're going to personally apologize to Mickey Torelli for the beating you gave him, and you're going to make sure that James Fitzgerald understands that his behavior today was noticed and will be remembered." The scattered bills on the ground represented more than just money. They were a symbol of the casual disrespect that had flourished in Vinny's supposed absence. Now, watching Webb scramble to collect the damp currency, Vinny felt a familiar satisfaction in the restoration of proper order. But most importantly, Marcus, you're going to spread the word through every speakeasy, gambling den, and street corner in Chicago that Vincent Torino never left. That every move made in his absence was made under his observation. That every slight against his organization was cataloged and filed away for future reference. Tommy stepped forward, his voice adding weight to his boss's words. "The Don's been watching everything, Webb. Every meeting, every collection, every time you boys thought you were making progress. He knows which cops you've been bribing, which judges you've been pressuring, which businesses you've been shaking down. Nothing happens in this city without Vincent Torino knowing about it." This was the truth that Webb was beginning to understand. Vincent Torino's power had never been based solely on his physical presence. It was built on a network of relationships, obligations, and mutual benefits that created a web of influence extending far beyond what any single man could control through force alone. The homeless man in the alley had been just another node in that network, invisible but connected to everything else. "Mr. Torino," Webb said carefully, What do you want from us?" Vinny considered the question, studying the man who had unknowingly provided him with the perfect opportunity to announce his return. Webb was small time, a foot soldier who followed orders without thinking about their larger implications. He could be useful as a messenger, but he would never be more than that. "I want respect, Marcus. The same respect that's been given to the Torino name for 15 years. I want the tribute that's owed on operations that were established long before your boss decided to expand his territory. And I want everyone in this city to understand that reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and the distant sound of jazz music from a speakeasy 3 blocks north, one of Vinny's establishments. Though Webb probably didn't realize it, the city was waking up to a new reality, or perhaps an old reality that had never actually changed. "Go," Vinny said quietly. "Deliver the message. And Marcus," Webb looked back, hope flickering in his eyes that this might be over. "The next time you see a homeless veteran, remember that in this city, you never know who you're really talking to." The meeting took place at Torino's, an upscale Italian restaurant in the heart of Little Italy that had been serving the best osso buco in Chicago for over a decade. To most patrons, it was simply a family establishment where businessmen brought their wives for anniversary dinners and where local politicians held quiet fundraising gatherings. But those with deeper knowledge of the city's power structure understood that the private dining room in the back had hosted negotiations that shaped Chicago's underground economy more than any city council meeting ever could. Patrick O'Malley arrived precisely at midnight, flanked by 2 bodyguards whose expensive suits couldn't quite conceal the bulges of shoulder holsters. He was a man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who had fought his way up from the South Side docks, and the careful eyes of someone who had survived 3 decades in a business where most men died before they turned 40. But tonight, those eyes held an uncertainty that hadn't been there since his early days as a dock worker, trying to avoid the attention of established crime families. Vincent Torino was already seated at the mahogany table when O'Malley entered, a cup of espresso cooling in front of him, and a plate of Maria Santos, famous biscotti, within easy reach. He had changed clothes again since the confrontation with Webb, now wearing a navy blue suit that spoke of wealth without ostentation, and a gold watch that had been a gift from the mayor after Vinny's organization had helped resolve a particularly messy longshoremen's strike without violence. "Patrick," Vinny said, rising from his chair with the kind of formal courtesy that belonged to an earlier, more civilized era of criminal enterprise. "Thank you for accepting my invitation." O'Malley took the offered seat, his bodyguards positioning themselves near the door with the professional alertness of men who understood that this meeting could determine whether their boss lived to see another sunrise. The Irish gang leader had built his reputation through careful calculation rather than reckless violence, which was why he had survived long enough to control a significant portion of the North Side gambling and bootlegging operations. "I'll admit, Vincent, when Webb came to me with his story, I thought the boy had been drinking too much of his own product," O'Malley said, his brogue carrying just a hint of the nervous energy he was trying to conceal. Three months without a word, and then you show up like nothing happened." Vinny poured himself another cup of espresso from the silver service that had been waiting on the table. "Nothing did happen, Patrick. That's what I'm trying to help you understand. Vincent Torino doesn't disappear. He observes, he evaluates. He makes strategic decisions based on complete information rather than emotional reactions." The restaurant around them was empty, except for the kitchen staff who had worked for the Torino family long enough to understand when conversations required absolute discretion. The soft sound of dishes being washed provided a domestic counterpoint to negotiations that would determine how Chicago's criminal landscape would be restructured in the coming months. "Your boys made some interesting moves while they thought I was indisposed," Vinny continued, his tone remaining conversational despite the gravity of the subject matter. 14 of my numbers runners harassed, 6 of my speakeasies pressured to switch suppliers, and approximately $15,000 in tribute. that should have come to me redirected to your operations. O'Malley had known this conversation was coming since Webb's panicked report earlier that evening. The Irish leader was smart enough to understand that Vincent Torino didn't call meetings to discuss forgiveness. He called them to establish terms for continued coexistence. Business opportunities arose, O'Malley said carefully. In our line of work, territory that appears undefended tends to be defended by someone else pretty quickly. I'm sure you understand the position we were in. I understand perfectly. What I'm curious about is whether you understand the position you're in now. Tommy Marconi entered the dining room, carrying a leather portfolio that contained detailed documentation of every move the O'Malley organization had made during Vinny's supposed absence. Bank records, police reports, witness statements, and photographs that demonstrated the kind of comprehensive surveillance network that separated professional criminal organizations from street gangs. We know about the dock workers you've been pressuring to skim cargo manifests, Tommy said, opening the portfolio and spreading photographs across the table. We know about the city inspector you've been bribing to overlook building code violations in your gambling houses. We know about the federal agent who's been feeding you information about planned raids. Each revelation hit O'Malley like a physical blow. The photographs were too detailed, too comprehensive to have been gathered hastily. This was evidence of months or even years of patient intelligence gathering, the kind of long-term strategic thinking that had made Vincent Torino the most successful criminal leader in the Midwest. The question, Patrick, is what we do with this information, Vinny said, his voice still carrying that deceptively casual tone. I could turn these documents over to Agent Harrison, who I'm sure would be very interested to learn about your federal informant. I could share the dock worker information with the legitimate unions, who tend to take a dim view of outsiders interfering with their operations. I could even arrange for your gambling house violations to be discovered during a surprise inspection next week. O'Malley understood the mathematics of his situation, with the clarity of a man who had spent 30 years calculating odds and survival probabilities. Vincent Torino wasn't just alive. He was demonstrating the kind of comprehensive control that made resistance not just dangerous, but pointless. And what do you want, Vincent? I want the same thing I've always wanted. A Chicago where business can be conducted professionally, where agreements are honored, and where territorial boundaries are respected. Vinny closed the portfolio and slid it across the table. I also want compensation for the revenue that was redirected from my operations, plus interest for the inconvenience. The number written on the paper inside the portfolio made O'Malley wince, but he had expected something like this. Vincent Torino had a reputation for being ruthless but fair. His punishments were designed to restore balance rather than simply inflict suffering. And in return, your organization continues to operate in the territories we agreed upon 3 years ago. Your people stay out of Little Italy and the South Side gambling operations, and everyone in Chicago gets a clear demonstration that Vincent Torino's death was greatly exaggerated. O'Malley studied the man across the table, trying to read the intentions behind those steel-gray eyes. Vincent Torino could have had him killed, probably should have had him killed, considering the territorial violations of the past 3 months. Instead, he was offering a path back to the status quo, with penalties but without bloodshed. There's one more thing, Patrick, Vinny said, his voice dropping to a more serious register. The federal investigation that sent me underground in the first place, it's not over. Agent Harrison is still asking questions, still pressure people, still building cases. The smart play for all of us is to maintain a low profile while he looks for bigger fish to fry. This was the strategic thinking that separated Vincent Torino from his competitors. While other criminal leaders focused on short-term territorial gains, he was always considering the larger forces that could threaten their entire way of life. Federal investigations, political changes, economic shifts. These were the real enemies that required careful management and long-term planning. O'Malley extended his hand across the table. You have a deal, Vincent. And for what it's worth, I'm glad you're not dead. Chicago's more interesting with you in it. Vinny shook the offered hand, but his grip conveyed the message that this clemency came with expectations. Just remember, Patrick, in this city, you never know who's watching. 6 weeks after the meeting at Torino's restaurant, Chicago had settled into a new equilibrium that looked remarkably similar to the old one. The O'Malley organization had retreated to their traditional North Side territories. The compensation had been paid in full, and the kind of territorial violations that had marked Vincent Torino's supposed absence had disappeared entirely. But the real changes were more subtle, visible only to those who understood how power actually flowed through the city's underground networks. Vincent Torino stood in his office on the third floor of Marconi Construction, looking out at the street scene below, through windows that had been specially treated to prevent surveillance from the building across the way. The construction company was one of his many legitimate businesses, and its success had allowed him to move beyond the crude territorial disputes that still occupied his competitors. While other crime bosses fought over street corners, Vinny was winning city contracts, building relationships with politicians, and creating the kind of economic value that made his organization indispensable rather than just feared. The office itself reflected this evolution. Instead of the typical criminal leader's lair, all dark wood and intimidating decor, Vinny had created a space that could have belonged to any successful businessman. Clean lines, modern furniture, and walls lined with architectural drawings of projects that would employ hundreds of workers, while generating millions in legitimate revenue. The only hint of his other activities was a single photograph on his desk, a picture of his old army unit, taken in France just weeks before the armistice, when Vincent Torino was just another sergeant trying to keep his men alive in a world gone mad. Tommy Marconi entered carrying the morning reports, a daily ritual that had continued throughout Vinny's 3 months on the streets, though now it took place in comfort, rather than through coded messages left in dead drops around the city. The reports covered everything from speakeasy receipts to police patrol schedules, from political developments at City Hall to intelligence about federal investigations that might affect their operations. "I believe the Harrison situation is resolving itself," Tommy said, settling into the leather chair across from Vinny's desk. His supervisor at the bureau has decided that the Torino investigation isn't producing enough results to justify the resources. Word is they're reassigning him to a bank robbery case downstate. This was the outcome Vinny had been working toward throughout his elaborate disappearance. By removing himself as a visible target while maintaining operational control, he had allowed the federal investigation to lose momentum and resources. Agent Harrison was smart and dedicated, but bureaucracies required measurable progress, and it was difficult to build a case against a man who appeared to have vanished entirely. "What about Jimmy?" Vinny asked, referring to his brother whose weakness had created the federal opening in the first place. "He's been clean for 6 weeks. No gambling, no drinking. Attending those meetings at St. Mary's every Tuesday and Thursday. Sarah's got him working as a bookkeeper for the restaurant supply business, and he seems to be taking it seriously." Family was both Vincent Torino's greatest strength and his most dangerous vulnerability. His organization inspired loyalty, partly because everyone knew that Vinny protected his people like family, but family members who couldn't protect themselves created opportunities for enemies to exploit. Jimmy's gambling debts had made him vulnerable to federal pressure, but his genuine efforts at recovery suggested that the crisis might be behind them. Maria Santos appeared in the doorway, her expression carrying the kind of urgency that meant important information had just arrived through her communication network. "There's a situation developing at the Riverside Speakeasy," she said. "Some out-of-town boys from Detroit are making noise about expanding their operations into Chicago. They're asking questions about you specifically, whether you're really back, whether the organization is as strong as it used to be." Vinny considered this development with the same methodical analysis he brought to every challenge. Detroit had always been a potential problem, close enough to Chicago to make territorial expansion tempting, large enough to support criminal organizations with serious resources, and far enough away that local intelligence was limited. But the timing of their inquiry suggested they had heard about his supposed death and resurrection, and were trying to determine whether the stories represented weakness or strength. "How many men?" he asked. "4 that we've identified. Probably more. They're staying at the Palmer House and spending money like they expect to be in town for a while. Word is they're working for Tony Battaglia, trying to establish whether Chicago might be ready for new management." This was exactly the kind of challenge that Vincent Torino's carefully constructed network was designed to handle. Rather than responding with immediate violence, the approach that had characterized earlier eras of organized crime, He had built an organization capable of gathering intelligence, applying economic pressure, and resolving conflicts through negotiation backed by overwhelming but invisible strength. "Set up a meeting," Vinny said after a moment of consideration. "Somewhere public, somewhere they'll feel safe. I want to have a conversation with these Detroit boys before they make any decisions they'll regret." Frank Castellano joined the discussion from his position at the communication desk, where he had been monitoring police radio frequencies, a technological innovation that gave the Torino organization advance warning of raids, investigations, and other law enforcement activities. "There's something else, boss. The story about you being homeless is spreading through the neighborhoods. People are talking about how you spent months on the streets, living like the guys who got forgotten after the war." This was an unexpected development, but Vinny recognized its potential value immediately. His time as a homeless veteran hadn't been calculated to generate sympathy, but the story was creating a different kind of respect than his organization had previously enjoyed. Instead of just fearing Vincent Torino's power, people were beginning to understand that he had chosen to experience the same hardships faced by Chicago's most vulnerable residents. "It's changing how people see the organization," Frank continued. "The guys who work the docks are saying that a boss who will live in an alley to understand his city is different from the usual criminals who just take what they want. Even some of the cops are talking about it differently." Tommy nodded his agreement. "Mrs. Mallory's been telling everyone who will listen about how you never caused trouble, never asked for special treatment, just tried to stay out of the way and keep warm. She doesn't know who you really are, but she knows you were respectful and grateful for every small kindness." This was the kind of reputation that money couldn't buy and violence couldn't create. The understanding that Vincent Torino's power came not from his willingness to hurt people, but from his willingness to understand them. It was a reputation that would make his organization more resilient against federal investigations, more accepted by the community, and more difficult for competitors to challenge. The telephone rang, interrupting the strategic discussion. Maria answered with practiced efficiency, listened for a moment, then covered the receiver with her hand. "It's Detective Morrison from the 7th Precinct. He says there's been a development we need to know about." Morrison was one of several Chicago police officers who had learned that cooperation with the Torino organization was more profitable and significantly safer than opposition. He wasn't corrupt in the traditional sense. He still investigated crimes, arrested criminals, and maintained his professional integrity. But he understood that Vincent Torino's network helped maintain order in neighborhoods where official law enforcement was stretched too thin to be effective. Vinny took the phone, his voice carrying the casual authority of a man who spoke with police detectives as equals rather than adversaries. "Morrison, what's the situation? Those Detroit boys you've probably heard about. They just made their first mistake. One of them got into an argument with Mickey Torelli outside Gallagher's Tavern. Started talking about how Chicago was going to have new management soon, how the old bosses were finished. Mickey tried to walk away, but they followed him into the alley." Vinny's expression hardened. Mickey was the young numbers runner who had been beaten by Webb and Fitzgerald months earlier, and who had been slowly recovering his confidence under the protection of the Torino organization. An attack on Mickey wasn't just an assault on one of his people. It was a direct challenge to the respect and safety that Vincent Torino guaranteed to everyone under his protection. "How bad?" Vinny asked. "Bad enough that he's at St. Mary's Hospital. Broken arm, concussion, probably some internal injuries. But he's conscious and talking. The Detroit boys are back at the Palmer House like nothing happened." This was the moment that would define how Chicago's criminal landscape evolved over the coming months. The Detroit organization was testing Vincent Torino's response to a direct challenge, calculating whether his supposed resurrection had restored his ability to protect his people and maintain order in his territory. Their choice to target Mickey specifically suggested they had intelligence about the earlier incident with the Irish enforcers, and were trying to demonstrate that the Torino organization couldn't even protect its most vulnerable members. "Morrison," Vinny said, his voice dropping to the tone that had once made federal agents reconsider their career choices, "I want you to arrest these Detroit boys. Charge them with assault, hold them for 48 hours, and make sure they understand that Chicago has laws against out-of-town criminals attacking local residents." "On what evidence?" "Mickey's testimony, witness statements from Gallagher's customers, and the kind of thorough police work that makes Captain Kelly proud of his detectives. I'm sure when you investigate this incident properly, you'll find everything you need to make solid arrests. After hanging up, Vinny turned to face his assembled lieutenants. The easy conversation of the morning had been replaced by the focused intensity that appeared whenever the organization needed to respond to external threats. This was the other side of Vincent Torino's leadership, the cold calculation that had earned him respect from men who understood that survival in their world required the ability to project overwhelming force when necessary. Tommy, I want you to visit Mickey at the hospital. Make sure he has the best medical care available, and let him know that this situation is being handled personally. Maria, get word to all our people that the Torino organization takes care of its own, and that attacks on our family have consequences. Frank, I want a complete intelligence report on the Detroit operation, who they work for, how much backing they have, and what their real objectives are in Chicago. But even as he issued these orders, Vinny was thinking about the larger implications of the Detroit challenge. His 3 months on the streets had taught him something important about power, that real strength came not from the ability to inflict punishment, but from the wisdom to choose when punishment was necessary and when alternative solutions might be more effective. There's one more thing, he said, his voice carrying the tone that meant he was about to reveal a strategy that others might not immediately understand. I want to arrange a meeting with Tony Battaglia himself. Not his soldiers, not his representatives, the man himself. Tommy looked surprised. Boss, Battaglia's not going to come to Chicago just because we ask, and going to Detroit puts us on his territory, where he has all the advantages. He'll come, Vinny said with quiet certainty, because I'm going to offer him something he can't get anywhere else, a lesson in how real power works. The kind of lesson that's worth more than any territory he might gain by fighting us. The plan that was forming in Vincent Torino's mind reflected everything he had learned during his months of invisibility and observation. Power wasn't just about controlling territory or generating revenue. It was about understanding the complete ecosystem of relationships, obligations, and mutual benefits that made a city function. The Detroit organization saw Chicago as a target for expansion, but they didn't understand the complexity of what they were trying to challenge. As his lieutenants left to carry out their assignments, Vinny remained at the window, looking out at the street where he had once walked as a homeless veteran, invisible to the people whose lives were shaped by his decisions. The view from this office was different from the view from that alley, but both perspectives were necessary for understanding how Chicago really worked. 3 months ago, Marcus Webb and James Fitzgerald had kicked a homeless man out of an alley, thinking they were asserting dominance over someone powerless. Today, their organization was paying tribute to Vincent Torino, and they had learned that in Chicago, you never knew who you were really talking to. Now it was time to teach the same lesson to Tony Battaglia and his Detroit operation. The methods would be different, the stakes would be higher, but the fundamental principle remained the same. In Vincent Torino's Chicago, respect was earned through understanding, maintained through strength, and defended through the kind of strategic thinking that turned potential enemies into reluctant allies. The homeless man was gone, but the Don who had learned from that experience was stronger than ever, and Chicago was about to remember why Vincent Torino had built the most successful criminal organization in the Midwest, one relationship at a time, one strategic decision at a time, one perfectly calculated demonstration of power at a time. The city belonged to him, and everyone in it, from homeless veterans to federal agents to ambitious criminals from Detroit, was about to be reminded of that fundamental truth. The Union Station's main concourse buzzed with the controlled chaos of a Tuesday afternoon in December. Travelers hurried between trains, while vendors hawked newspapers and cigarettes, their voices creating a symphony of commerce that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. But Vincent Torino wasn't interested in the legitimate business of Chicago's transportation hub. He was here because Union Station represented neutral territory, too public for violence, too busy for private surveillance, and impressive enough to remind Tony Battaglia that Chicago operated on a different scale than Detroit. Vinny sat at a corner table in the station's restaurant, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him, while he observed the carefully orchestrated arrival of the Detroit delegation. Tony Battaglia entered flanked by 2 bodyguards who tried to look casual, while their eyes catalogued every potential threat in the crowded space. Battaglia himself was a man in his early 50s, built like a dock worker, but dressed like a banker, with the kind of calculating intelligence that had allowed him to survive 15 years in Detroit's particularly brutal criminal landscape. The meeting had been arranged through intermediaries, Maria Santos contacting associates in Cleveland, who maintained relationships with Detroit operations. The message had been simple. Vincent Torino wished to discuss recent misunderstandings between their organizations, and believed that a face-to-face conversation would prevent unnecessary complications for both parties. "Mr. Torino," Battaglia said as he approached the table, his voice carrying the slight rasp of a man who had spent too many years breathing the industrial air of Detroit's factories. "I'll admit, when I heard you wanted to meet, I was curious. Most people in our line of work prefer to send messages through more traditional channels." Vinny gestured to the chair across from him, noting how Battaglia's bodyguards positioned themselves with clear sight lines while maintaining enough distance to avoid drawing attention from station security. It was professional work, but it also revealed something important about how the Detroit organization understood power. They still thought in terms of immediate physical threats, rather than the broader strategic considerations that shaped modern criminal enterprise. "Thank you for making the trip, Tony. I thought it was important that we discuss the situation personally, before it escalated beyond what either of us would find profitable." Vinny's tone was conversational, but his steel-gray eyes were cataloging every detail of Battaglia's appearance and demeanor. "Your boys made quite an impression on one of my associates, young man named Mickey Torelli. I believe you know the incident I'm referring to." Battaglia's expression didn't change, but his hands moved slightly on the table, a tell that suggested he was more concerned about this meeting than his casual manner indicated. "Business sometimes gets rough. In Detroit, we've learned that clear communication prevents misunderstandings. Interesting philosophy. In Chicago, we've learned that sustainable business relationships require mutual respect and an understanding of each party's core interests." Vinny paused to take a sip of his coffee, using the moment to study Battaglia's reaction. "Which brings me to why I wanted to meet with you personally, rather than simply responding to your communication through traditional channels." From his jacket pocket, Vinny withdrew a manila envelope that contained documents Tommy Marconi had spent 2 weeks assembling, financial records, shipping manifests, and police reports that painted a detailed picture of the Detroit organization's recent activities, not just in Chicago, but in their home territory as well. "You see, Tony, when your people started asking questions about expansion opportunities in Chicago, it made me curious about what kind of operation would feel confident enough to challenge established territorial arrangements. So I did some research." Battaglia opened the envelope, and Vinny watched his expression shift from casual confidence to genuine concern as he realized the scope of intelligence that had been gathered. Bank records showing cash flow problems, documentation of a federal investigation into dock worker corruption, and photographs of Detroit operations that could only have been taken by someone with access to areas that should have been secure. "Your longshoremen's union is about to be audited by the Department of Labor," Vinny continued, his voice maintaining that deceptively casual tone. "Apparently, someone provided federal investigators with evidence of systematic wage theft and intimidation tactics, the kind of evidence that could result in criminal charges, not just union decertification." This was the strategic thinking that separated Vincent Torino from common criminals. While Battaglia had been focused on territorial expansion through force, Vinny had been studying the vulnerabilities that could destroy the Detroit organization without requiring a single act of violence in Chicago. "But here's what interests me most about your situation, Tony. Those problems in Detroit, they're solvable. The federal investigation could disappear if the right information reached the right people. The union audit could find irregularities that point to previous management, rather than current leadership. Your cash flow problems could be resolved through partnerships with organizations that have access to more diverse revenue streams." Battaglia studied the documents for several more minutes, his face showing the calculations of a man who understood that he was being offered something valuable at a price that hadn't yet been specified. Around them, the station continued its bustling activity, travelers and workers moving through the space without any awareness that they were witnessing a negotiation that would reshape criminal activities across the Midwest. "What do you want, Torino? I want you to understand that Chicago isn't Detroit. We don't resolve territorial disputes through street violence because we've evolved beyond that level of operation. We've built something more sophisticated, a network of legitimate businesses, political relationships, and community connections that makes old-fashioned gang warfare not just unnecessary, but counterproductive. Vinny leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained private despite the noise of the surrounding crowd. Your organization attacked one of my people because you thought it would demonstrate strength. Instead, it demonstrated that you don't understand how power actually works in a modern city. Real power isn't the ability to hurt people, it's the ability to make their problems disappear. The proposition was elegant in its simplicity. The Detroit organization would retreat from Chicago and acknowledge the territorial boundaries that had existed for years. In exchange, Vincent Torino would use his federal contacts to resolve their labor union problems, his financial network to address their cash flow issues, and his political connections to ensure that future expansion opportunities were directed toward territories that wouldn't create conflicts with established operations. You're offering to help us in exchange for us not competing with you, Battaglia said, his voice carrying the tone of a man who was beginning to understand that he had walked into a negotiation where his opponent held all the significant advantages. I'm offering to demonstrate why cooperation is more profitable than competition. Detroit has advantages that Chicago doesn't: better access to Canadian smuggling routes, stronger connections with automobile industry workers, established relationships with certain federal agents who focus on prohibition enforcement. Chicago has advantages that Detroit doesn't: more diverse legitimate business opportunities, stronger political connections, and a more sophisticated approach to community integration. This was Vincent Torino's true genius, the understanding that criminal organizations, like legitimate businesses, succeeded through strategic partnerships rather than endless territorial warfare. While his competitors exhausted themselves fighting over street corners, he was building relationships that created value for everyone involved. Battaglia closed the envelope and met Vinny's eyes directly. And if we were to decline this generous offer, then you would return to Detroit and deal with your federal investigation, your union audit, and your cash flow problems without assistance from Chicago. Your people would continue to believe that territorial expansion through violence is a viable strategy, right up until they discovered how expensive it is to challenge an organization that controls relationships rather than just territory. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Vincent Torino wasn't just offering help. He was demonstrating the kind of comprehensive intelligence and strategic reach that could make life very difficult for organizations that chose confrontation over cooperation. I need to discuss this with my associates, Battaglia said finally. Of course, take all the time you need. But Tony... Vinny's voice carried the tone that had once made federal agents reconsider their career choices. Mickey Torelli is in the hospital because your people thought Chicago was weak. When you make your decision, remember that every day he's recovering is another day. I'm reminded that some people still don't understand how this city works. As Battaglia and his bodyguards left the restaurant, Vinny remained at his table, finishing his coffee while watching the crowd flow through the station's main concourse. In 3 hours, he would receive word that the Detroit organization was withdrawing from Chicago and accepting his offer of assistance with their federal problems. Within 2 weeks, Mickey Torelli would receive a formal apology and compensation for his medical expenses from Tony Battaglia personally. But the real victory wasn't the resolution of a territorial dispute. It was the demonstration that Vincent Torino had evolved beyond the crude methods that still defined most criminal operations. He had built something more sustainable, more resilient, and ultimately more powerful than anything that could be maintained through violence alone. The rain had returned to Chicago, falling in steady sheets that turned the streets into rivers and made the December air bite with the promise of snow. Federal agent Robert Harrison sat in his car outside St. Mary's Catholic Church, watching through rain-streaked windows as figures moved through the amber glow of the church's interior lights. Tuesday evening AA meetings had become routine surveillance for him, not because he expected to arrest anyone, but because Jimmy Torino's attendance represented the last viable thread in an investigation that was systematically unraveling. 3 months of pursuing Vincent Torino had yielded nothing but dead ends, bureaucratic pressure, and the growing suspicion among his supervisors that he was chasing ghosts. The initial informant reports that had launched the investigation, claims that Torino was planning to expand into federal interstate commerce violations, had proven impossible to corroborate. Witnesses had disappeared, documents had been destroyed or proven fraudulent, and every lead had evaporated under scrutiny. But Jimmy Torino represented something different. Where his brother Vincent was careful, calculating, and seemingly untouchable, Jimmy was weak, desperate, and burdened with the kind of personal problems that made men vulnerable to federal pressure. His gambling debts, his drinking, his obvious fear of his own family's reputation. These were the cracks that experienced investigators learned to exploit. Harrison checked his watch. 8:45 p.m. The meeting would end in 15 minutes, and Jimmy would emerge into the rain, probably walking the 6 blocks home to his small apartment above Marconi's barbershop. It was a routine that had continued for 10 weeks, ever since Jimmy's latest attempt at recovery had coincided with increased federal interest in his family's activities. The church doors opened, and Harrison recognized Jimmy's silhouette immediately, shorter than his brother, softer around the middle, with the hunched shoulders of a man who had spent his life apologizing for disappointing people. But tonight, something was different. Instead of walking alone toward his apartment, Jimmy was accompanied by another figure, a tall man in an expensive overcoat who moved with the casual authority that Harrison had learned to associate with serious criminals. Tommy Marconi, Vincent Torino's lieutenant, and the man responsible for operational security within the organization. His presence at Jimmy's AA meeting wasn't coincidental. It was a message. Though Harrison wasn't sure whether it was intended for Jimmy or for any federal agents who might be watching, Harrison started his engine and followed at a distance as the two men walked through the rain-soaked streets. Instead of heading toward Jimmy's apartment, they turned east, moving through the industrial district toward a part of the city where legitimate businesses closed early, and the only activity after dark involved enterprises that preferred to avoid official scrutiny. The destination was surprising: Torino's restaurant, the upscale Italian establishment that served as one of Vincent Torino's most successful legitimate businesses. Through the restaurant's windows, Harrison could see well-dressed diners enjoying expensive meals, while a small orchestra provided background music. It was the kind of place where city councilmen brought their wives and federal judges celebrated anniversaries. Hardly the setting for the kind of criminal conspiracy that Harrison had been investigating. But the two men didn't enter through the front door. Instead, they walked around to the alley behind the restaurant, where Tommy produced a key that opened a service entrance. Harrison parked across the street and settled in to wait, knowing that whatever was happening inside would determine whether his investigation continued or finally died, the bureaucratic death that had been threatening for weeks. Inside the restaurant's private dining room, Vincent Torino was finishing a conversation with Sarah McKinney about the quarterly financial reports when Tommy and Jimmy arrived. The contrast between the two brothers was striking. Where Vincent commanded attention through intelligence and careful authority, Jimmy seemed to deflate in his presence, like a man who had spent his life being reminded of his inadequacies. "So Jimmy," Vincent said, rising from his chair with the formal courtesy that belonged to an earlier era. "Thank you for coming. I know Tuesday evenings are important to you." Jimmy remained standing near the door, his hands shaking slightly despite 10 weeks of sobriety. "Vinny, I need to tell you something. The Fed, Harrison, he's been pressuring me. Wants me to wear a wire, record conversations, provide information about the family's business activities." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Sarah looked up from her financial reports. Tommy's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket, and Vincent's expression shifted to the cold calculation that had once made grown men reconsider their life choices. "How long?" Vincent asked quietly. 2 weeks. Ever since I started the program. He approached me outside the church, said he knew about my debts, my problems, said he could make them disappear if I cooperated with their investigation. This was the moment that Vincent Torino had been anticipating since Agent Harrison first began asking questions about the organization. Federal investigations followed predictable patterns. They started with financial records, moved to surveillance and informants, and ultimately depended on family members or associates who could be pressured into cooperation. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I've been going to meetings, staying clean, trying to figure out what to do. But Vinny," He knows things. About the barber shop, about some of the old gambling debts. He's got files, photographs, bank records. Vincent walked to the window that looked out on the alley where Agent Harrison was conducting his surveillance. The federal agent's car was visible in the streetlight, its windows fogged with condensation but its position providing clear sight lines to both the restaurant's front and rear entrances. "Tommy, call Maria. I want her to contact Detective Morrison and have him run the license plate on the sedan across the street. I also want a complete background check on Agent Harrison. Family, finances, career ambitions, personal weaknesses, everything." But even as he issued these orders, Vincent was thinking about the larger implications of Harrison's pressure on Jimmy. Federal agents didn't invest weeks in developing an informant unless they believed that informant could provide evidence of significant criminal activity. Harrison's persistence suggested either exceptional dedication or pressure from supervisors who expected results. "There's something else," Jimmy said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He knows you're alive. He knows about the homeless thing, about how you've been watching everything. He doesn't have proof, but he knows." This revelation changed the entire dynamic of the situation. If Harrison understood that Vincent Torino had been orchestrating events while supposedly missing, it meant the federal investigation was more sophisticated than it had appeared. It also meant that Harrison represented a genuine threat that would require more than bureaucratic maneuvering to resolve. "Jimmy, I want you to listen to me very carefully," Vincent said, his voice carrying the tone that had once commanded absolute loyalty from dozens of dangerous men. "You're going to continue attending your meetings, continue staying clean, continue living your life exactly as you have been, but you're also going to accept Agent Harrison's offer." The words hit Jimmy like a physical blow. His face went white, and for a moment Vincent thought his brother might collapse entirely. "You want me to become an informant? I want you to become a double agent. You're going to wear Harrison's wire, attend his meetings, and provide him with exactly the information I want him to have. You're going to help me feed Agent Harrison enough genuine intelligence to satisfy his supervisors, while ensuring that none of it can be used to build a criminal case against anyone in this family." This was Vincent Torino's strategic genius in action, the ability to transform apparent weakness into operational advantage. Jimmy's vulnerability would become a weapon. Harrison's investigation would become a source of intelligence about federal priorities, and the pressure that was designed to destroy the organization would instead strengthen it. "Vinny, I can't. I'm not smart enough for this kind of thing. I'll make a mistake, say the wrong thing, get us all arrested." Vincent moved closer to his brother, his voice softening slightly. "Jimmy, you've been making mistakes your whole life, and this family has always protected you. Now it's time for you to protect the family. You don't have to be smart. You just have to be exactly who Harrison expects you to be. A weak man who's afraid of his brother and desperate to avoid prison." Tommy stepped forward, his expression showing the mixture of admiration and concern that appeared whenever he witnessed Vincent's more complex strategies. "Boss, this is dangerous. If Harrison suspects Jimmy is feeding him false information, then we'll deal with that situation when it develops. But right now, Agent Harrison believes he has leverage over Jimmy, and Jimmy believes he has no choice but to cooperate. Those beliefs give us an opportunity to control what information reaches the federal government and how that information is interpreted." Outside, the rain continued to fall, and Agent Harrison continued his surveillance, unaware that his investigation was about to be transformed from a threat into a tool. In 3 days, Jimmy Torino would contact him and agree to become a federal informant. Within 2 weeks, Harrison would believe he was building a case that would dismantle Vincent Torino's organization, but the information he received would be carefully crafted to lead him away from the family's actual criminal activities and toward a manufactured conspiracy that would ultimately discredit the entire investigation. Agent Harrison would get his headlines, his supervisors would get their conviction statistics, and Vincent Torino would eliminate the last federal threat to his organization while maintaining his reputation for being untouchable. The last card had been played, and once again Vincent Torino had transformed an opponent's apparent advantage into his own strategic victory. Spring had returned to Chicago, bringing with it the kind of warm breeze that made the city's inhabitants forget the brutal winter they had endured. The trees along Michigan Avenue were showing their first green leaves, and the sound of construction from new building projects created a symphony of progress that spoke to the economic recovery that was slowly spreading across the nation. Vincent Torino walked the familiar streets of Little Italy, no longer disguised as a homeless veteran, but not quite the same man who had disappeared into the alleys 6 months earlier. The federal investigation had concluded 3 weeks ago with Agent Harrison's reassignment to a bank robbery task force in St. Louis. The manufactured conspiracy that Jimmy had helped build, complete with fabricated evidence of illegal alcohol importation that led to a defunct operation in Milwaukee, had provided enough apparent success to satisfy Harrison's supervisors while ensuring that no actual members of the Torino organization faced criminal charges. Jimmy himself had emerged from the experience with a new confidence that came from successfully completing a mission that required intelligence rather than just loyalty. The Detroit situation had been resolved even more elegantly. Tony Battaglia's organization was now operating in Cleveland, where Vincent's connections had helped them establish legitimate business partnerships that eliminated their previous financial difficulties. The federal investigation into their dock worker operations had quietly disappeared, and Battaglia had sent Vincent a case of authentic Canadian whiskey, along with a handwritten note expressing his appreciation for a lesson in modern business practices. But as Vincent approached the narrow alley behind Mallory's delicatessen, he was thinking about more personal matters than territorial disputes or federal investigations. Mickey Torelli had recovered from his injuries and been promoted to managing collections for the Southside gambling operations, a position that provided better pay and more respect than his previous work as a numbers runner. Webb and Fitzgerald had returned to their traditional territories, with a new understanding of the boundaries that define Chicago's criminal landscape. Mrs. Mallory was outside her shop, sweeping the sidewalk with the methodical attention of someone who took pride in maintaining her small corner of the neighborhood. She looked up as Vincent approached, her face showing the polite curiosity of a shopkeeper greeting a potential customer. "Good morning, Mrs. Mallory," Vincent said, his voice carrying none of the defeated tone he had affected during his months of disguise. "I was wondering if you might have any of those excellent sandwiches I've heard so much about." She studied his face for a moment, something flickering in her eyes that suggested recognition without complete understanding. "You look familiar, young man. Have we met before?" "I don't believe so, though I've spent some time in this neighborhood. I've heard wonderful things about your establishment from several people." This was the truth that Vincent had come to understand during his time on the streets, that respect and recognition were not the same thing. Mrs. Mallory had shown kindness to a homeless stranger without knowing his identity or expecting any reward. Her treatment of Vincent Torino, the vagrant, had revealed more about her character than any background investigation could have provided. "Well, come inside then. I just finished making a fresh batch of that minestrone soup my grandmother taught me to prepare. And I have some nice roast beef sandwiches that should satisfy a working man's appetite." The interior of Mallory's delicatessen was exactly as Vincent remembered it: clean, organized, and filled with the kind of attention to detail that spoke to genuine pride and craftsmanship. Mrs. Mallory moved through her domain with the confident efficiency of someone who had been serving her community for decades, treating each customer as if their business was the most important part of her day. "You know," she said as she prepared his order, "we had some trouble in the neighborhood a few months back. Some rough characters were bothering people, especially the veterans who sometimes need a little help getting back on their feet. But that all stopped suddenly. Word is, someone reminded those troublemakers that this community takes care of its own." Vincent accepted the sandwich and soup, noting the generous portions and reasonable price that explained why working families could afford to eat here regularly. "It sounds like you have good people looking out for this neighborhood." "We do indeed. There's a man, Vincent Torino, who's been helping families around here for years. Never asks for anything in return, just makes sure that people can go about their business without worry. Some folks say he's involved in activities that aren't entirely legal, but I've never seen him do anything but help people when they needed it most." This was the reputation that Vincent had spent 15 years building, not just as a successful criminal leader, but as someone who understood that real power came from being genuinely useful to the community he served. His speakeasies provided employment and entertainment. His protection services kept neighborhoods safe, and his legitimate businesses created opportunities for advancement that the conventional economy often denied to immigrant families. "He sounds like a good man to have in the neighborhood," Vincent said carefully. "Oh, he is. Just last week, his people helped my nephew Antonio get a job with one of the construction companies that's building those new apartment buildings on Taylor Street. Good honest work that pays well enough for Antonio to support his family properly." As Vincent ate his lunch, he listened to Mrs. Mallory's stories about the neighborhood, the families she served, and the quiet ways that Vincent Torino's organization had woven itself into the fabric of Little Italy's daily life. It was a perspective he had never heard during the strategy meetings in expensive restaurants or the negotiations in private offices where most of his business was conducted. "Mrs. Mallory," Vincent said as he finished his meal, "what do you remember about the homeless veteran who used to sleep in your alley? The one who was here during the winter months?" Her expression softened, showing the kind of genuine compassion that had motivated her to leave food scraps for a stranger who couldn't offer anything in return. "Poor man. He never caused any trouble. Always polite when I brought him something to eat. Had the look of someone who'd seen too much violence but was trying to make peace with the world. What happened to him? Some terrible men threw him out one day, roughed him up pretty badly. I was so angry I almost called the police. But then everything changed. Those same men came back a few days later to apologize, and they left money to pay for any damage they might have caused. Said they'd been given a lesson in respecting people who'd served their country." Vincent left a generous tip along with payment for his meal, but as he prepared to leave, Mrs. Mallory called after him, "You have kind eyes, just like that veteran did. Different circumstances, but the same understanding that life can be hard for people who are just trying to get by." Walking back through the streets of Little Italy, Vincent reflected on the conversation and what it revealed about the changes the past 6 months had brought to his understanding of power and responsibility. The homeless veteran who had slept in Mrs. Mallory's alley was gone, but the lessons learned during those months of invisibility had become part of Vincent Torino's approach to leadership. Tommy Marconi was waiting in the office at Marconi Construction, reviewing the weekly reports that documented the steady expansion of their legitimate business operations. The construction company had just won a contract to build a new elementary school. The restaurants were showing consistent profits, and the network of relationships that protected and sustained their activities had never been stronger. "Everything go well at Mallory's?" Tommy asked, looking up from the financial reports. "Better than well. I was reminded why we do this work, and why it's important to do it right." The telephone rang, and Maria Santos' voice came through the intercom with news of another opportunity requiring their attention. "There's a situation developing with some out-of-state operators who think Chicago might be ready for new management. Different city this time. They're coming from Kansas City." Vincent smiled, settling into his chair with the comfortable confidence of a man who had learned that real power wasn't about avoiding challenges, but about being prepared for them. The game would continue. New players would test the boundaries, and Vincent Torino would remind them of the fundamental truth he had discovered during his months in the alley. In Chicago, you never knew who you were really talking to. But now he understood something even more important, that the strength of his organization came not just from intelligence networks and strategic thinking, but from the genuine connections it maintained with people like Mrs. Mallory, Antonio's family, and the homeless veterans who sometimes needed help getting back on their feet. The Don who had emerged from the alley was the same man who had built Chicago's most successful criminal organization, but he was also someone who understood that true power meant being useful to your community, respectful to your neighbors, and mindful that everyone, from federal agents to homeless veterans, deserved to be treated with the dignity that comes from recognizing their humanity. Vincent Torino had returned to his empire, but he had brought with him the wisdom that could only be learned by walking in other people's shoes, sleeping in their alleys, and understanding that in the end, we are all just trying to find our way home through the rain-soaked streets of an indifferent world.